I also want to thank them for the very nice memorial we had in name of Peter Flaschel. He's a great inspiration to our work in the GEM macro modeling team at the AFD. I think that slides 4 of Cristiano's presentation could be perceived as a manifesto for our approach. And so thank you very much for having that. The main message of what I'll try to do today is to give you the importance, to give you an idea of the importance of using a strong sustainability approach when trying to design, steer, and assess development strategies and trajectories. To do so, I will give you various examples of research projects that are developed at the research department at the AFD, AFD with a high cap F, not the small cap one. It's important. Most of the projects have been conducted in collaboration with partners in developing and emerging economies, and this is why I have many colleagues here as well in the name of the presentation. So what I'll try to do first is broaden the definition of strong sustainability. I will come from a biophysical perspective and then extend it to a more socio-ecological, economical perspective. Then I will talk a bit more about strong sustainability trajectories. I will have a bit of theoretical consideration, and I'll move on to indicators and then trying to anticipate the constraints to steer the economy, and I'll conclude finally. So the strong sustainability emerges from a biophysical perspective. There's a very nice book by Neumayer published in 2003, and the fundamental ideas is, first, there is no or little substitutions among factors of different sort of natural capital, and second, which is a follow-up of this first idea, is that you should have multi-criteria, multi-dimensional aspects, and avoid at all costs monetization and synthetic indicators. I'll give you 2 examples of this. We recently did interesting work on biodiversity with Banque de France and Office Français de la Biodiversité and others. And then Etienne Espagne, who's in the room here, has done a very interesting work on climate damages in Vietnam. And then if you take this idea of the strong sustainability from this biophysical perspective and extend it to socio-ecological economic perspective, you keep the same 2 principles, but you add socio-economic dimensions, criteria, on top of these biophysical ones. I'll give you some examples related to multidimensional poverty analysis that my colleagues are conducting in different countries, and also a work that will be presented by my colleague Guilherme tomorrow on multidimensional macroeconomic vulnerabilities related to the low carbon transition. So biodiversity. Of course, biodiversity is the perfect example of strong sustainability. It has the word diversity in its definition, so by definition you have to have different variation of biodiversity. To give you an idea, you have diversity within species, between species, of ecosystems, both in the terms of the diversity of the ecosystems themselves, but also of the functional diversity of these ecosystems. For example, of different type of ecosystem services, we can think of provisioning services, so groundwater, plant and animal food, regulation and maintenance services such as flood and storm protection, water flow maintenance, and cultural services such as enjoying the forest. And these different services are actually based on different basic ecological functions. So if you try to assess biodiversity, you should already start by having these different services, these different functions in mind, and consider them as non-substitutable. So you can't choose to only protect cultural services but endangering provisioning services. So this is the core of the analysis that we were doing with Banque de France and other colleagues on trying to understand what would be the consequence of a silent spring for the financial sector in France. There are 2 ways in which you can try to assess the interconnection with the financial system in general and the real side, of course, and biodiversity. First, the impacts that the sector, the different sectors and finance has, and then the dependency. On the impact side, we nonetheless kept a synthetic indicator, which is the MSA per square kilometer, which it basically reflects how much surface of pristine biodiversity has been destroyed. And the main results we have there is that almost 24% of France's superficie has been impacted by the production process and the financial system. The more interesting work that we did was on the dependency, and where we tried to see how the different ecosystem services were necessary for the production processes, and how much of these production processes were at the risk of being constrained by loss of biodiversity. And we obtained 42% of the portfolio of French financial institutions are dependent on at least one of these ecosystemic services. So you see that biodiversity and the variety of biodiversity, because it's about water, it's about land use, it's about different ecosystemic services, the variety of these ecosystemic services make biodiversity a key element to consider when you talk about the low carbon transition and the ecological transition in general. The second work I'm presenting here is by my colleague, as I said, and it reflects to the usage of damage and climate damages. The literature on climate damages is unfortunately relatively weak on damages and filled with approximations and let's say bad economics. It is important when you try to understand the climate damages that you look at the different ways in which climate damages will enter into the economy. And these will be sectorial, but also within a sector have different effects. So this is the idea that my colleague Etienne was conducting in Vietnam, where he tried to identify different channel mechanisms that the climate change would impact the macroeconomic of Vietnam. Agriculture, energy, factor productivity, mortality rate, number of workers. And it's by looking at these different channels and then combining them into a macro framework that you get a very interesting assessment of climate impacts in Vietnam. I will come to the conclusion towards the end of the presentation, but just to give you an idea, this is the kind of damages where you have on the x-axis the temperature change, and on the y-axis how much each of the different type of damage would amount directly, and we'll assess the indirect effects afterwards. Now, moving from a ecological or biophysical definition of sustainability, let's try to see how you can extend it into socio-ecological economic aspects. The first one is coming out of our project funded by the EU on inequality and inequality diagnosis in different countries. And this is results for South Africa. And first, the approach really looks at multidimensional inequality. When we talk about inequality, we tend to have like income inequality or wealth inequality and have some synthetic indicators as Gini. Here, the work is really trying to understand how the dimension of inequality is touching different groups of people, different locations, and also different types of services or economic indicators, trying to see whether there is first different distribution of this inequality, but also whether there are differences in which the dimension of inequality was touching these different groups of persons. So we can think about access to services, we can think about different groups such as female-headed households, labor market trends, and assessing these different types of inequalities allow them afterwards to try to understand what would be the consequences and what were the consequences of the lockdown following the COVID-19 in South Africa, and trying to see how the consequences were different across regions. So this is very at the provincial level, but also impacting different types of person depending on the nature of the group to which they belong, or on the nature of the service they were lacking. The next work, I'm going to go further and take a more macro perspective, and this is my bias. Here, it's a work that Guilherme will present tomorrow as well, where we try to understand the different vulnerabilities that might emerge for developing and emerging economies in the context of a low carbon transition. Of course, this is something that you probably all have in mind. The low carbon transition is fundamentally a structural change. Right? You have sectors that will disappear, sunset industries, and you have sectors that will emerge, sunrise industries. And these processes are led by different mechanisms, market, policies, change in preferences, and so on and so forth. And as such, and because of the different production structure that you have in these countries, the countries will be impacted differently. And they will have different macroeconomic impacts. So what we try to do is to understand to use three key indicators. The first one is related to trade and balance of payment. We try to understand how much the economy at hand is dependent on sunset industries to raise foreign currency, net foreign currency. The second one is trying to understand how much the economy at hand is depending on sunset industries to raise fiscal revenues. And the last one is trying to understand how much social aspects, and we are using very economic social aspects, employment and wage generation. And what you get is we have direct and indirect effects again, so direct effects directly impacting the sunset industries, and then indirect effects taking into consideration how sunset industries disappearing have impacts on other non-sunset industries. And you have here a multi-dimensional analysis. The annex R is the raise of foreign currency, wages and employment is fairly evident, production and taxes. And you see that the way in which countries are impacted and the way in which countries are vulnerable to the low carbon transitions are very different. You have cases where there is no difference between direct and indirect effects, such as Kuwait or Venezuela. You have cases where there is no foreign constraints, for example, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Ecuador, and so on and so forth. And so it is really important to try to understand how these countries will be impacted by the low carbon transition. And this allows us then to cluster them and see, okay, depending on the nature of the economy, are they generally highly exposed? These are the groups in purple, I guess. Do they have more external exposition? Do they have more socio-economic exposition? Or do they have low exposition? And to do this, we also factor in capacity to adapt by using other indicators that highlight the fact that even if an economy, Belgium, for example, is an economy which is highly exposed because of chemicals, because of pharmaceuticals, but in the end, Belgium has the capacity to innovate, has good social protection mechanism, and hence they are not really exposed. Now, if you take into this consideration the importance of having this multidimensional analysis, how do you define strong sustainability trajectories then? And this, a small sidetrack on theoretical consideration. So this is a recent work we started to do, and the idea is combining balance of payment constraints, debt sustainability constraints, and the green trilemma that Sebastian Valdecantos has coined very nicely in a recent paper. And the idea is take into consideration what are the growth rate you need for having Keynesian stability, which is compatible with demography and technological change, balance of payment growth rate, which is consistent with the rest of the world, and elasticities of import and exports. What if these two growth rates are not coherent? What if the growth rate that is consistent with the balance of payment is not sufficient to guarantee the Keynesian stability? Now, let's say we can add constraints on needing to stabilize the public debt. And there's a nice paper by Bering et al. In 2019, and that requires another growth rate. And again, you have three growth rates now, which says you have to have debt stability, foreign balance of payment, and employment, or Keynesian. But now, and that's where it becomes very interesting, let's add the Kaya equation. If you look at the Kaya equation, it says how much you can grow given your demography, given the evolution of CO2 intensity on your economy, and given the evolution of energy intensity. Two of these parameters are completely technological. One is policy, but you don't really want to touch it. So in the end, you have a growth rate which, given the ambition in terms of CO2 reduction, is consistent with that. So you have now a fourth growth rate. What happens when these four growth rates don't really work? And take into consideration that when you do an ambitious CO2 reduction plan, this will change the growth rate which are consistent with the balance of payment constraint, with the Keynesian stability condition, and with the debt sustainability condition. Let me give you an example. So here we start with a situation. It's the blue line. I don't know if, yeah. The blue line is the initial condition. Let's take the case where, by chance, the growth rate on terms of unemployment, public debt, and balance of payments were actually all equal. And we move from a more ambitious CO2 reduction, and hence have to reduce the growth rate that would be consistent with this CO2 reduction. This changes the nature of the unemployment growth rate, or unemployment warranted growth rate, the public debt warranted growth rate, or the balance of payment, and they actually go in different direction. So in the case of public debt, you will, because the investment in the low carbon transition will require probably public financing, you will have to have a higher growth rate to make sure that the public debt is still sustainable. In terms of the balance of payment, because especially for developing economies, it's likely to spur imports. You have to actually have a lower growth rate than before. And in the case of unemployment, because the low carbon transition is likely to be more labor intensive, you don't have to have such a higher growth rate. So you see that the growth rate, because of the low carbon transition, has changed, and the possibility or the probability of having the three growth rates to be at par is becoming very, very low. So when you take this into consideration and when you want to start designing strong sustainability trajectories, it is important that the policymakers, think tanks, civil society, in order to have commitment to this transition, have to understand and be able to anticipate these dynamics. And this is why the modeling exercises and what we do at the GEM project in AFD is important for us, is because we can actually highlight this. We can highlight the constraints, the opportunities, and the vulnerabilities of this transition. And they have to be combined of both descriptive dynamics, which is based on history and based on institutional setup, into social setup, but also normative aspect, because you have a policy implementation behind, and you have to make sure that the normative aspect is mitigated by the descriptive aspect. And this is where the indicators are very important. I'll give you an example on that in a minute. But also, what I just showed highlights the importance of understanding that the emergence of transitions will lead to tensions. And this is where the work of Peter Flaschel is so important, because it highlights the importance of disequilibrium modeling. You also have path dependency, because the timing of investment matters. You have different dynamics both in the short term and the long run, but also the importance of the structural dynamics and the interconnections with the institutional dynamics. I was recently in Uzbekistan, and if you go to Uzbekistan and you explain that you are going to use whatever model, market-based, they laugh at you and they say, no, this is not how it works. The institution doesn't fit with the modeling exercise you are proposing. So let me just get back to the indicator. The AFD has been recently developing, in partnership with the UCL, a measure of the distance to environmental limits. We call it the S-gap. So the idea is to say, how far are you from a desirable situation, and how far have you moved from an original situation? So you can decompose into two different situations. So you start at the initial situation, you are now here, and you can already say, okay, how much have you gained? So this is the SESP, Sustainability Progress Index, which measure how much over time did you move towards sustainability standards. But then you can also compute, and that's where the gap comes in, you can compute what should be the trend in terms of sustainability and measure how far you are from there. And this is the SES, Index of Strong Environmental Sustainability. Now, this desirable situation here is in a 1D plan, or 2D plans, but there's a 1D ecological status. But actually what we do is we divide it into different indicators in terms of resource, pollution, life support, health and human well-being, and so on and so forth. And we applied it to different countries. And you can see that, of course, there's a lot of data which is missing, especially in developing economies, but also in developed economies. And we can assess how far you are from meeting the standards on that specific aspect, say on resources. And why am I saying this is really important? We did an assessment on Europe, and you can see on the different, well, you can't really see, but if you have really good eyes, you can see the different aspects. So, for example, in terms of source function, you have forest resources, fish resources, surface water resources, groundwater resources, and so on and so forth. And you see there that there are few blue is the darker blue is the average for Europe, and then you have light blues for all the different countries. And you can see that there are few dots where there are few aspects or all the dots are in the same place. And it's ozone depletion, it's groundwater, it's air pollution. These are three cases where Europe decided on an indicator or a set of indicators and applied them for a long time. And you see that when you agree on these indicators, you can actually design policy implementation, and it actually worked. For the record, the small blue dot here, that is climate change. So we have a good indicator, but yet we fail. Now, I was mentioning the case of climate change in Vietnam, and so I'll go back to try to give you an insight of and see why you have to go and listen to Etienne tomorrow. So what they did there is they used the different RCPs. So the RCPs are the evolution of climate depending on certain socio-economic scenarios, and what it means in terms of change in temperature. And of course, you have to change that for Vietnam, because change in mean temperature in the world doesn't mean that all the countries will face the same consequences. So you have to then use different models and different scenarios to assess what happens in Vietnam. And that's why you have a lot of uncertainty on the right-hand side. You see that the evolution of climate has a lot of actually uncertainty. Yeah. So. And it also changes the probability distribution. So the different climate scenarios change the probability distribution, and so anyway, it's important to assess all of these uncertainty in climate. And what you see here on the right-hand side is all the different aspects, all the different damages that they had individuated in terms of agriculture, mortality, life productivity, labor productivity, total factor productivity, energy, and the box plots of the different aspects depending on the climate scenarios and depending on the different models to be used, and then you can see how much the dotted line represent what in terms of direct damages this implies, right? And then if the values are above 100, that implies that you have a lot of indirect. Well, the more you are above 100, the more you have indirect damages. And you can assess them in terms of the aggregate damages for the economy. So you see that having this sectorial analysis and this precise channels of diffusion allows you then to build a much broader analysis at the macroeconomic level of these different damages, and allows Vietnam in this case to be able to anticipate this and build adaptation strategies adapted to each of these specific climate hazard. Let me try to conclude. I didn't talk about opportunities. I only had vulnerabilities and constraints, but of course there are opportunities. It is possible to benefit from transitions. Of course, there's a lot of work that show the importance of, the effects in terms of employment creation. There's a lot of interesting work in terms of research and development and green products. There's what I call old wine in new bottle. The story that is coming to again here, you can hear the new music. Okay. Oh, but you know what? Developing economies are rich in natural resources. We didn't try that in the past. CEPAL has been producing a lot of interesting work on the environmental big push. And what is also, I think, very interesting, and this is something that the AFD has been working on, is that because of climate change is already happening, but also because we are understanding that nature in general has very systemic effect on the economy at the local level, but also at the global level. What we have is the emergence of actual practices which reinforce concepts such as the just transition or the commons, and it's really interesting to see how very specific, localized responses to constraints lead to further developing concepts which have been theorized in the past. So if I try to conclude, first, I think it's really important that we talk about trajectories and transitions. Sorry about, it's not a socio-ecological transition. Each will be different and based on local and global contexts. It is really important to have multidisciplinary indicators, scenarios, and models. And I think it's really important to be able to couple different types of models, including techno-economic or agricultural model with macro models. The strong sustainability approach here seeks to explicit as much as possible constraints, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. Yes, we are all convinced that it is important to do these transitions, but they shouldn't be done just because. I think we have to get out of the magical thinking that, technological will save us. Let's talk about CCS or afforestation or carbon compensation. I've heard recently about green coal. The green coal is you sell your coal, but because you afforest afterwards, it's fine. we should talk about, in terms of magical thinking in ecological, we have to be very careful about damage functions, but also how we will treat biodiversity. And we really are at a crossroad here. Biodiversity is getting more and more momentum, but if we go in the wrong direction, it will set the path, and we will be stuck in a really bad direction. We have to be aware of political magical thinking, green growth, or green finance. Of course, finance is important, but not at any cost, and not, it's not the main driver. And one last thing, what you see is that the transitions that I have highlighted here are very polycentric. That means that they have different levels, that they have different center of interests, and multidimensional by nature. And these require to think about governance structure, both at the local, local, national, and global, and their interactions. And this is really a key challenge for us economists, is how do we make sure that the thinking and the design in terms of trajectories can be met with a governance structure that actually implements that. And avoiding silos. If you go and talk to policymakers, especially in developing economies, but it's true in developed economies as well, sectoral ministers don't like to talk to each other because they have all their prerogatives and they don't want to share. And so it is really important to highlight the importance of this multidimensional debate. In these aspects, the commons can be of very great help to go in the right direction. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.